my experience with this has come from about 40 years of teaching in universities and giving presentations at scientific meetings all over the place, and probably a couple thousand model railroad clinics. So let me see if I can't figure this out. Probably not. Oh, yeah. Okay. So this is a scene from my old railroad around 2015 or so when I was living in Florida. I put this up not so much to brag about the picture, which I think is pretty good, but to remind you that this is a hobby. And that's an interesting thing when you're talking to people, is that people are coming to your presentation because they want to be there, not because they have to, like talking to a class full of students. They don't want to be there. So you really have to put on a top hat and a cane then. But people are coming to your presentations because they want to learn something. So make sure that you do that. So I always title all these slides, how do I keep myself awake during my own clinic? Show your passion and your interest. Remember, you're the expert. This was something my major professor taught me years ago. He says there's only one person in the room who knows what you're talking about. That's you. No matter what the topic is, you're the expert. So act like an expert. Interact with the audience. That's the really fun part, is to interact with the audience. They have questions. You can answer them immediately. You can talk about what you've done and things like that. And tell a good story. Tell a good story about what you've done, what you haven't done, what you should have done. And I'll get to some interesting stories in a minute or two. For example, I model the Southwestern US in ON30, which didn't exist in the Southwest, but it's close enough to narrow gauge that it's good. I need to know what the era is and what mix of figures and what mix of automobiles and things like that I need on my layout. Well, I model essentially what would have been the old Chile line that ran from Antonito, Colorado down to Santa Fe, New Mexico. So I got a whole bunch of pictures of Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I said, well, I'm modeling about 1951, 1952. What did it look like then? And I was surprised to see what it looked like then. This is the coal yard in Santa Fe in 1942. Still horse-drawn carts. So it shows you that not the entire world is marching right along with World War II. Old laundry, all the people in uniform. Isn't that neat? Everybody delivers everything in uniform. There's the Gross Kelly warehouse. It's the biggest warehouse in Santa Fe. It's a big, huge adobe structure. So that's something you would want to have if you're modeling Santa Fe. But again, all of the vehicles and everything else are old. That's a dry cleaner. Ran around town in Santa Fe. Everybody in uniform with the tie and the whole bit. This is 1954. So these are old vehicles still being used into the 40s and 50s. So again, how do you keep from falling asleep? Show your own passion, show your own interest in the topic. Everybody here today has done that. That's great. I want to hear people who really like what they're doing. And don't ever talk about things you have absolutely no interest. I've gone to a few of those, and the audience discovers real fast, this guy doesn't care. And then you got to sit there for an hour listening to a guy who doesn't care. So talk about stuff that makes you excited and explain why it's important to you. When I'm modeling the area that I model, I have to look at the Rio Grande River. Here is the Rio Grande. I'll never figure out there it is. Okay. Here's the Rio Grande near the town of Embudo. Embudo, New Mexico is about halfway between Taos and Santa Fe. I was just here about 2 weeks ago collecting dirt. And I looked at this and I say, these are the trees I've got to have. This is what it's got to look like. Cottonwoods and willows and a few Russian olives and things like that. Those are things that I need. I take lots of pictures of scenery that people think I'm crazy. But here's the station at Embudo. Typical Rio Grande Western railroad station. This is pictured early in the 1910s, something like that. Nice wooden station. The station master, John Wallace, spent most of his day, because the Rio Grande goes on this side of the river, fly fishing in the river. Because he only had 2 trains a day, and they both passed Adambuto at about noon. Otherwise, he had nothing to do. So John Wallace would go out and fish, and then eventually he realized there was a whole lot of water-washed rocks. And so he started very slowly hauling them up in his pockets and putting them against the wall of the station, so that a few years later, it looked like that, all stone. And he built it all the way to the roof with this. That's the same old station about 15 years later. It's still there. It's available for sale, by the way, if you want to spend about $2.5 million. It's right there on the Rio Grande. So interact with the audience, encourage questions from the audience. Don't be afraid of questions. What you have to be afraid of is silence, because either they're all asleep, or you're boring, or you're in trouble. So give examples and demonstrations. And this is something that I will hit because sometimes I don't like this. Please give examples. Please give demonstrations, but don't pass them around. Have you ever sat in an audience of, say, 60 people, and you've got 8 or 10 different examples being passed around, and they get out of order and everything else? You're looking down here, the guy's talking up there, you don't know what's going on. Try to avoid that. Sometimes you can, but try to avoid that. And finally, request a nice demonstration table where you can lay everything out and show everybody. I thought that was great with the foam rocks. That was a great way to do it. So I can, for example, show you something that I could have passed around when I was giving a lecture on cardstock modeling about how to make a hole in the roof, because it involves a layer of underlayment. That's all printed cardstock, tar paper with a hole cut in it, and then the tar paper going on top of the underlayment. And then here's a row of shingles, and you can start putting the shingles on. And I could have passed each and every one of those around. And so everybody's going, which order is this? Where does this go? Where does this go? You're not listening to what people are talking about. So if you can do it this way, do so. Please avoid passing things around. Okay, so how you keep from falling asleep in your own clinic? Tell a good story. Be conversational, especially if it's a good story. Tell how you got interested in the topic. And don't be afraid to exploit your own misadventures. I will tell you a story. I gave a talk about 30 years ago at a big international scientific meeting in Stirling, England. And I was going to talk, and the laser pointer failed. Well, I always have a pointer with me. So I walked over to the screen to show what I was showing. Nobody told me it was a portable stage, and it didn't go all the way back to the screen. I fell right off the back. Now, this was before a room of about 200 people. And I went whomp down on the ground and crawled back up and continued on with the talk and everything else. First question from the audience: do you always do that? Well, of course I do. And I think for the next 10 years, I was introduced as the guy who fell off the stage. All over. So that happens. Okay, so here's a good story, too. This is the crossing of the Rio Grande at a place called Ottawa Bridge. This is the highway road that goes from Santa Fe up to Los Alamos. And not very interesting, there's the freight station and the passenger station. They sometimes had 2-3 people a year get on the train there. But over here is a little tiny place. It was just a house with an extra room added onto it. It was called the House at Ottawa Bridge. It was a tea room run by a lady named Edith Warner. Edith Warner was the gatekeeper. If you were a scientist in Los Alamos until about 1950, I think, 1948, the furthest south you could go from Los Alamos without special permission was the House at Ottawa Bridge. You could not go further south. She was in charge of checking everybody's IDs. And they all had strange names. They weren't given their real names. The one that I remember is Enrico Fermi, his real name or his name on his ID was Eric Farmer. And everybody had their own secret name and they all had to be signed off and things like that. Here's Edith Werner with her husband. That was pretty scandalous anyway. So that's an interesting story about the railroad, but it doesn't really contain much about the railroad, but still a good story. Do use PowerPoint if you can. If you can become adept at PowerPoint, please do. The one thing that I tell people not to do is to never read from the screen if you can avoid it, because then people are saying, I can read too. So you don't need to do that. Only 2 or 3 bulleted points per slide. They got to be big and bold. You don't want to put a list of 30 or 40 items down there, except in special circumstances, because people are trying to read and go ahead of you and everything else. So if you can, animate your points. That takes a little bit of a learning curve on PowerPoint, 20 minutes maybe. It'll take you to learn how to do that. Animate them. Introduce them one at a time. Make the audience listen to you, not trying to read ahead. So for example, here I'm talking about layering again on a cardstock building. I put in a part there, that's tar paper and siding. There's another arrow, that's lifted siding, that's all paper, that's all cardstock. And there's underlayment, tar paper and shingles, like I showed in that pass around thing, or not pass around thing. So you can use those things almost better than you can use the laser pointer, I think. It points to the things that you need. Let's see what we got here. Oh, yes. Black words on white backgrounds are incredibly difficult to read. We're used to it because we read newspapers and books and everything else. But yellow on green, you want to see something that's really dramatic? Yellow on green. It's much easier to read than white on or black on white, or white on black, as far as that goes. And so here's a presentation on how to count rivets and aggravate your friends. If you're a rivet counter, I think we've all known at least one rivet counter in our lives. So here you go. Walk with your nose held high, for sure, if you're a good rivet counter. Act like you know everything about anything. That's another thing if you're a good rivet counter. And finally, never have your own layout. Okay. So PowerPoint presentations, the next alternative I choose is white on blue. Depending upon the size of the room and how dark it is, white on blue reads better than black on white. And that's easy to do. And if you bold them and shadow them a little bit, they're easier to read in a dark room. So, how to stay awake at an MRA clinic. First of all, bring toothpicks for your eyelids. That always makes people think you're awake, even if you're not, except the irises kind of roll up in the forehead. And then sit on the most uncomfortable chair you possibly can, particularly if it's the death period. That is the hour immediately after lunch, because people are in there fighting their digestion as well, trying to stay awake. So sit on the most uncomfortable chair you can find. That was the most uncomfortable one I could find. It's made out of saguaro cactus. If you sat on that, you're going to stay awake, or at least scream a lot. Okay, so in NMRA clinics, some easy things to talk about. Layout tours and updates. It's easy to talk about. You're enthusiastic. You built it. It's great. It's easy to talk about. Scenery techniques, easy to talk about. You're open for lots of demonstration and things like that. Weathering techniques, again, easy to talk about. You can demonstrate it. You can show lots and lots of pictures. And structure and construction techniques. Those are easy to talk about. And 99% of us do that most of the time. So those are easy ones to talk about. The ones that I find difficult to talk about, well, we'll get there. Pick a project if you're going to do a hands-on clinic, and eventually you will wind up doing that. I've been doing it for about 12 years now with modeling with the masters at national conventions and a few regional conventions. Pick a project that can be accomplished in the time period. Usually that's 2, 3, or 4 hours. Then come to the realization that only about 75% of the people will finish. You cannot get everyone on the same wavelength. It just doesn't work. So they're going to be wanting to work at their own pace regardless. and then give a short PowerPoint with a presentation. We're going to do step A, we're going to do step B, we're going to do step C. Then go all the way back to one first and say, okay, step A, everybody go. And then by step 2, half of them are still in the middle of stage 1. Okay, and if possible, have an assistant who can wander around from table to table and help out as well. Okay, so one of the big messages, all of your presentations should be picture and graphics rich, not so much lots and lots of words. Not so easy presentation topics. At least in my experience, these are the ones which tend to be the ones that get a little bit difficult to sit through sometimes. A description or examination of a single class of cars or motive power. Try to listen to a talk on, say the GP30 for 45 minutes or an hour. You got to be really excited about GP30s, for example. Railroad prototype history can be really exciting, or it can be another killer because people say, I don't even model that part of the world. I don't care. And so you've lost half your audience right there, unless you're the one who's telling the story. Electronics projects, if you're not electrically inclined, it's going to be difficult to sit through. It just is. Even if you can ultimately do the electronic project, it's hard to make electronics projects exciting. The Navy taught me 40 years ago how to repair a whole bunch of electronics equipment. I still find it incredibly boring. I still don't understand electronics. So be careful about that one. And the last one can be really exciting, or they can be really boring too, is at operations and layout design. Those can be really exciting if you can follow the technique. I go to a lot of those because I want to know how to set up my layout for operation and things like that. But when I wake up at the end of the presentation, I've discovered that I've missed most of the stuff. So you got to be careful about that. Operations, layout design things can be really exciting, or they can be really boring. I figured that's why NMRA has special interest groups for operations and special interest groups for layout design, because all of those guys really want to know. And so they're all in that room and cordoned off by themselves. Okay, and again, must tell a good story and be picture and graphics rich. People like to look at pictures. If you got handouts, by all means, they help overcome the confusion. People can then write down their own notes on the back of the handout. It's all theirs. It's their personal property. It doesn't matter if they're neat and clean or scrawled all over the place. It's yours. And besides that, you get author points in the AP category for authors if you give handouts for a talk. If you don't give any handouts for a talk, it doesn't count. So the handouts work. That way, it's part of the author certificate. So, for example, here's an update on my old Amos and Rio Grande. I had to put this in there. That's all cardstock. So cardstock is easy modeling stuff, as you've found out. It's easy to model with, things like that. That's on my new layout also. I gave this talk on building or making trifold souvenir programs, if you will, of my layout. I had the unfortunate experience, if you don't like people to visit your layout, try a busload of 50 arriving at once. In Orlando, they did this thing called I think they called it the Pinup Tour. It was 4 layouts that had all appeared on the cover of the NMRA calendar. And so they went from Orlando by bus all the way out to Odessa, Florida, which is on the West Coast. Then they came down to Gail Comar's layout, and then they went to my layout, and then they went back in to John Wilkes' layout, and then back to Orlando. All in one day, 50 people. They're all hungry. They want something to eat. And so I had this little trifold brochure so people could take a look at the layout. And I gave a talk on how to build a trifold layout because it took me forever to figure it out. I haven't made one for my new layout, but trifolds have to be printed real funny. And my abilities with Word just about hit limits. But try to get 50 people into a layout that will accommodate 10, 15, 50 of them. And they all show up at once, and a big bus pulls into the driveway. They're all coming in. And my wife is out there greeting them. She has a magical middle finger right out of the back of her head, I'll tell you. She did not like 50 people in her house all at once. She had made cookies. She had made everything, sodas and everything like that. I had a video running in the living room. I had individual structures that people could wander around and look at because they could only come in 10 at a time. So I had to give them tickets to come into my layout. And they had to rotate in and rotate back out every 10, 15 minutes so that they could see the layout, get back on the bus, and go bother John Wilkes. So that's a difficult thing to do. So beware if you're going to have layout visitors. I don't mind people visiting my layout, but not 50 at a time. I've decided 50 at a time is the limit. Okay, so the take-home message is real easy. Have a passion for the topic. Tell people you're interested in this. Tell a good story. And again, text and graphics rich presentation. I will tell you one more story about people giving talks. This I thought was the most clever thing I'd ever seen in my life. I was at a meeting, it was somewhere in the United States. All I remember is that this young lady who was a graduate student from somewhere had submitted her paper for presentation and had been rejected. But she was going to come to the scientific meeting anyway, because it was the society for people who work in riverine ecosystems, and she was going to be there to meet all the people and talk to the correct people and everything like that. She arrived, she checked in, she got the program. Her presentation was listed as being given. Well, she hadn't put anything together. This is back in the days when when your presentation was done on 2x2 slides in a tray. So she borrowed a blank tray, and then she went to 23 different people and got a slide. Just said, give me a slide, doesn't matter, from your presentation. And she got 23 different slides from 23 different presentations, put them all into the carousel in various order, upside down, inside out, backwards, popped it on, they called her up, and she gave the talk. And as she gave the talk, she'd explained to everybody that she wasn't scheduled, or she had been rejected and then scheduled. She gave this talk, and every once in a while, she'd flip a slide. And there'd be a slide, something sideways, upside down, backwards, had nothing to do with what she was talking about. She gave the entire thing in her allotted 20 minutes of time. It was the most hysterical thing I'd ever heard in my life. The best presentation I think I've ever heard. I had no idea what she was talking about, but it was great. Okay, so that's it.
Question.
Uh-huh.
The last one. Do you mean photo and graphics rich or text?
Text and text and graphics rich, but the text should be big and 2 or 3 per slide, and graphics rich as appropriate. Yeah. Yep.